Hey there, welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and today we are going to compare two of the best dual sport motorcycles ever made, the Suzuki DR650 and the Honda XR650L. So if this is the first video of mine that you've ever seen, I've owned both of these bikes for just almost a year now. Before that, I had actually two KLRs, a Gen 2 and a Gen 3, and in between those and sort of alongside the Gen 3, I rode a Tenere 700. I've also got a 701 Enduro in the garage and a TW, and there's quite a few other bikes that I've had some experience on. But over the last year, I've been really focusing on these two and sort of trying to get a feel for how they compare, what is better about one than the other, what I like more about one than the other, and sort of how they work as far as on and off-road riding. I'm also doing sort of a light adventure dual sport build on both of them, so if you guys are interested in any of those videos, I can put the playlist down in the description. Today's video is going to basically kind of cover the differences that I've noticed. Some things are just sort of fun little facts, some are important if you're deciding between these two, and others just kind of are going to give you a little bit better idea of what bike is a little bit better for what type of riding. And I certainly don't want to spoil anything by saying this, and I don't really think that I am, but there really isn't a clear winner between the two. I don't think either one of these bikes is better than the other. If you guys do, I would love to hear that discussion down in the comments section, or if you think there's another bike out there that's a better option than these two. But really, just like any motorcycle, I think you have to look at the type of riding that you want to do, the type of rider that you are, and sort of what your expectations and needs are from a motorcycle, and then sort of make a decision based on that. And there certainly, I think, is one of these that is much better at one thing, and the other is kind of much better at the other. And to be honest, until I rode both of these things side by side, I really didn't realize how different they were, and I actually got quite a few comments when I acquired both of these last year that I basically bought the same exact motorcycle, and just looking at them at sort of a high-level view, I mean, they're both bikes that have essentially been around and unchanged since the 90s. This bike came out in, I believe, 1990. This one was kind of 92, 93. Both of them had predecessors before them that really weren't all that much different. This bike sort of came from the SP600, and this came from the XL600R. And while both of them, mostly, I guess, the Suzuki, have seen some updates over the years just to kind of fix issues, neither of them have really been changed like the KLR has over the years. I mean, they really have just kind of stuck with the almost exact same design that they came out with initially. They are also fairly similar in a lot of aspects. Both of them are big bore, sort of air-cooled singles, which we'll get into and clarify in a bit here. They're both really meant for kind of on and off-road riding. Obviously, we talked a little bit about one leaning one way or the other, and we'll start to see that a little bit more once we get into the specs and my experiences with them. Both of them have a fairly strong aftermarket support, although the DR650 certainly has a lot more options out there. The XR650 has some of which you can see on the bike already, but it doesn't quite have the same amount of support, and I think there probably are a lot more DR650s out there. And I suppose we could kind of take a bit of a poll down in the comment section. How many of you guys are on one of these bikes or the other? Just let me know which one you've got down there. I think that'd be kind of interesting. And if you have ridden both of them, let me know which one is your favorite as well. And if I didn't mention that, I paid $6,000 for this bike, and I traded my Gen 3 KLR that had quite a few mods on it just straight for this bike. Both of them did come with the Seat Concepts seats on them, and both of them had a different set of Tusk D-Flex handguards on them. Now I've done bar risers and chub bars on both of them, and obviously quite a few other mods. The DR did come with the side case covers as well as the D-Sport tires. This had the stock tires on it and no case protection, but did have the IMS foot pegs on it. And it did actually come with an oversized fuel tank that I decided to pull off just to do some testing on the stock tank, because again, I'm basically trying to compare these two more or less as close to stock as I could get them. I definitely would recommend some Seat Concept seats. Neither stock seat is anything I think that anybody would really want to ride on for any extended period of time if you're going to be doing, again, any type of road riding. I've also really come to like the Seat Concept seats with the gripper top, because then no matter what you're doing, you don't feel like you're getting sort of thrown back or sliding forward or sliding around in the seat. It just sort of plants you nicely wherever you want to be, but at the same time doesn't really keep you locked in position too much that you can't move around. So it's just a really nice amount of friction and definitely makes the ride both on and off-road, I think, a lot better. So the first thing is kind of a fun, odd fact. The DR650 here has 2 spark plugs and 1 exhaust outlet, where the XR650 has 1 spark plug and 2 exhaust outlets, which is sort of something that Honda's been doing for kind of a long time. And now actually on the new DRZ4S, Suzuki is also implementing this dual spark plug technology, which I think especially on a big bore single like this makes a bit of sense because you've got, well, kind of a large piston in there, and if you can ignite the fuel air mixture in two different locations, you'll get sort of a more equal burn. As previously mentioned, both of these bikes are technically air-cooled, meaning they use the fins around the piston and jug to sort of dissipate the heat into the air, as opposed to bikes like the XR650 that use a water pump, antifreeze, and sort of a normal radiator and cooling fan. The DR650 here, however, does actually have a radiator that passes oil through it, or an oil cooler, and you can add that to the XR650 as an aftermarket accessory, but of course that takes a bit of money and a bit of work. And that, I think, along with some of the other stuff that we'll get into, sort of makes this bike, well, probably a little bit better both on and off-road, and also makes it kind of last a little bit longer. And again, I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments if you've had any issues with either of these over the years, but from what I've seen, I think the XR650L, and maybe this is something to do, or maybe more to do with the fact that people ride these a little bit harder than the DR, but it seems like these, well, maybe need a rebuild a little bit sooner than the DR does. I've seen these bikes out there with lots and lots of miles on the original motor. I have also seen some chewed off teeth on oil pumps and heard about issues with, I think, third gear it is. There are some other issues that I will eventually make a video on, probably both of these bikes, but the XR, really the only thing that I've heard about is the CDI box going out. And I suppose if you run the stock sprocket, which has a very, very small area that contacts the spline, you can have issues where it'll actually chew those teeth off. And that essentially would cause you to have to take, or someone else to take, the entire engine apart to replace it. But while neither of these are technically bulletproof, they are definitely proven to be reliable with some slight modifications. Now this next one, I don't really think is a reason to buy one bike over the other. It's just, again, sort of an interesting fact. And that is that the DR650 here carries its oil in basically the same place as the KLR does, or really a lot of other motorcycles, which is essentially just in sort of the bottom portion of the engine, where the XR650L here actually carries its oil inside of the frame. So instead of dumping oil into the engine, you actually dump it in right behind the handlebars. And like I mentioned, that's sort of just kind of an interesting fact, but it may contribute to something that we'll get into here in a little bit, even though it is only a couple quarts. Just keep in mind that the DR keeps the majority of its oil in the bottom portion of the engine. Next up, probably one of the biggest reasons that people go with the DR650 over the XR650, or maybe feel like they just can't go with the XR650, is the seat height. The XR650L has a 37-inch stock seat height, which puts it 2.2 inches above the stock seat height of the DR650. The DR650 stock seat height is 34.8 inches, but Suzuki has actually designed in something to the forks and into the swing arm that you can adjust a few things and drop that seat height to 33.8 inches, which is much more beginner-friendly, certainly more beginner-friendly than the XR seat height. This bike, however, if you guys haven't seen the videos, I actually dropped the rear end 1 inch using the Hemisphere Off-Road adjustable lowering link, which will allow me to drop this, I believe, another full inch if I would like. The front of the bike, I dropped 3/4 of an inch, basically just by loosening up the triple trees and sliding them down to the lowest most point that Honda left for us on the fork tubes. If I do sit way at the front here, even without riding boots, I can easily get my foot flat on the ground. I have a 31-inch inseam. I'm about 5'10", and I weigh about 155 pounds. I am sort of shifted off to the side of the bike a little bit, but honestly, I don't even really know that I would need to. And I suppose it would make sense to throw a leg over the DR here, and I would say that, yeah, this actually almost feels exactly like the XR. The XR seat is definitely not as sort of rounded, but boy, that feels a lot like a DR650, maybe even a little bit closer to the ground. If you guys are unfamiliar, the rake is essentially the angle measurement from a vertical line drawn straight down in the air in comparison to the angle that the forks are stuck out from that line at. The XR has a little bit less rake from the factory than the DR does when both of them are in their sort of factory configuration, but because I dropped the back of the XR a little bit more than I was able to drop the front, technically we'll have a little bit more rake, which should be actually a little bit better for off-road. And I know a lot of you guys are probably gonna freak out just like I used to about how I lowered a dual sport motorcycle. I know that seems like an incredibly silly thing to do. And if you're somebody that only spends time off-road, much like my windscreen, it's something that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But if you're looking for a bike that's gonna perform on-road and off-road, and you're not really going to be doing a whole lot of log hopping or motocross riding or anything really insane off-road. Bringing the center of gravity down on this bike really, I think, made it handle a lot better for, well, 99% of the riding that I will ever do with this bike, and I take this bike on some pretty darn nasty trails, and honestly, while lowering it has made it a lot more fun to ride, again, because that center of gravity is lower, the DR650 in its highest configuration still does feel a lot more kind of glued to the road, glued to the trail. I'm much more willing and able to sort of fishtail around the corners on this bike, where the XR still feels a little bit high, which really does make sense because even though I've lowered it now, the ground clearance on this bike is still over 12 inches. And that is actually our next big difference. In stock form, the DR650 has a ground clearance of 10.4 inches. If you were to lower it, it would be somewhere around 8.8 inches, which puts it kind of close to what the KLR650 is, where this bike stock comes with 13 inches of ground clearance, which is, again, sort of why I really didn't feel too bad or wasn't too concerned about lowering it, because 12 inches of ground clearance, over 12 inches of ground clearance, is still far more than any motorcycle that I've ever owned. And again, being somebody that spends a decent amount of time on the road, it doesn't bother me at all. I've still easily been able to overcome every single obstacle that I've come across with this bike, where the DR650, well, I've had a little bit of an issue here and there. This next difference actually sort of, I think, kind of relates to the ground clearance a little bit, and that's the fact that the DR650 here, which again has a lower ground clearance, only has a 17-inch rear wheel, where the XR650 has an 18-inch rear. Both of them do have a 21-inch front, which is sort of standard for a dual sport and a lot of adventure bikes as well. And if you guys are unfamiliar, the larger diameter of the rim, and thus usually anyways the tire, the easier it is to sort of get over obstacles, just because you've got a little bit more mechanical advantage on them. The center point of the tire is just higher, so it can just physically roll over obstacles much easier. And that is sort of the same case with the rears. Of course, if you run into something with the skid plate and high center the bikes, then it doesn't really matter how big the rear tire is. But like I said, I have come across obstacles with the DR650 that stopped me in my tracks that I was able to easily clear with the XR650. The XR650L here, as best I can measure it, does seem to have a, well, half-inch larger diameter tire in comparison to what I've got on the DR650. That being said, the D-Sport on the back of the DR650 is a little bit more worn out than the Waypoint on the back of the XR650. But either way, whether it's ground clearance or the tire size or a combination of the two, I have been able to clear obstacles much easier with the XR. So if you haven't already started to notice, to me anyways, it seems like the DR650 leans a little bit more towards the road side of things, or maybe more accurately towards being a true 50-50 dual sport, where the XR650L, especially without being lowered, it kind of leans a little bit more towards almost a motocross bike, and certainly is a better off-road motorcycle. But with that being said, keep in mind that both of these bikes currently have a 14-tooth sprocket on them, and I would take either one of them over any of my KLRs on the highway, because even though both of these just have a 5-speed gearbox, that ratio seems to be a little bit wider than that of the KLR 650, meaning that even with 14-tooth sprockets, both of them seem much more comfortable and capable at 70 miles an hour, or even a little bit more. And if you are somebody that's going to spend a lot of time on the freeway with the stock 15-tooth sprockets, both of them did, I would say, a phenomenal job. Of course, keep in mind that they are big bore dual sport dinosaurs, not parallel twins, so they're certainly not going to feel as good as a lot of today's midweight adventure bikes. But with the exception of the brand new 2025 KTM 390 Adventure R, both of these bikes are, well, almost 100 pounds or more lighter than a lot of the midweight ADVs, and I can tell you from personal experience that they are much, much, much more enjoyable to ride off-road. I took both of my KLRs through stuff that I think a lot of people would think is kind of silly, myself included, which is why I've gone to these lighter bikes, and you certainly can do just about anything on a KLR. I will always love those motorcycles, but these are so much more fun to ride off-road, and I've definitely taken them down some pretty gnarly trails that I personally did not ever want to take either of my KLRs on. But weight is actually my next point here, and the DR650, even though, like I've said, actually handles much better, other than something that we'll get into in a bit, but it actually feels much lighter just to even pick it up off the side stand or to pick it up off the ground, which is really kind of surprising considering that this bike is 20 pounds heavier than the XR650. 20 pounds heavier, that is a huge difference, and honestly, it does not feel that way when you get on these bikes. This bike feels so much lighter on its feet than this bike does. Again, because most of its weight is carried down low, where the XR650 is kind of carrying its weight quite a bit higher. And because of the higher seat height, even when lowered, it's carrying your weight much higher, so it brings the total center of gravity up a lot higher, which again just makes this bike feel a little bit more planted and is just a lot more fun to ride. And now, of course, you more experienced riders, I'm sure, could ride circles around me if you were on this bike and I was on the DR, but that's not really my point. I'm just saying that this bike is just more comfortable and fun to ride, and the majority of us that just want to get out there and see the scenery and putt around a bit, or maybe even ride a little bit harder, I think are going to enjoy a little bit more, and at least are maybe going to be able to progress a little bit faster until you get into anything rough. And that is sort of part of the next big difference in the specs and also in sort of the feeling of the ride that you get out of both of these bikes, and that is the suspension. The XR650L here, both in the specs and sort of the feeling and performance department, has vastly superior suspension. The DR650 has 10.2 inches of suspension travel in the front and 10.2 inches of travel in the rear, which is 0.8 inches less in the front and 1.4 inches less in the rear than the XR650, which has 11.6 inches of travel up front and 11 inches in the rear. And while you'd think somewhere around 10 inches of travel would be more than enough, the fact that this bike just has such a soft, overly plush suspension, just really kind of like I've hinted at a little bit here, really throws things off. And I think the more that I'm riding this bike, the more I realize that a lot of the aspects that make me prefer this bike, honestly, both on and off-road, I think can really be attributed to the nice sort of stiff, firm suspension that this bike has. And honestly, I really never feel uncomfortable on or off-road because of that. It seems like it handles the bumps and just even the turns just so much better, and some of that could be the geometry and just sort of the layout of the bike. But this bike, I think you can definitely get away with the stock suspension if you don't plan on riding over anything too bumpy, and if you don't really care too much about handling. You certainly can make do, and I have been, and I'm not saying I haven't been enjoying this bike. I love both of these motorcycles, but this one, from my own experience and from what I've heard from you guys, seems like it will be a vastly better motorcycle with just a few $100 stuck into the suspension. And I will be doing that this spring, sort of one step at a time. So if you guys want to make sure you see that, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you guys watching along each week. But of course, even with an upgraded suspension, the DR650 doesn't have quite as much travel as the XR650 does, which again sort of makes this bike lean a little bit more off-road, as does this next category, and that is the wheelbase. The DR650 is actually 1.4 inches longer as far as the wheelbase goes in comparison to the XR650. The XR has a 57.3-inch wheelbase, where the DR650 has a 58.7-inch wheelbase. And I think some of that contributes, again, to why this bike maybe feels a little bit more nimble and easier to ride off-road, where the sort of longer wheelbase on the DR, I think, makes it feel a little bit more, again, solid and planted on the road, I think especially on the highway. But of course, having just a lower center of gravity, I think also is going to improve that, and is again why we're starting to see that this bike is maybe a little bit better for true 50-50 riding, or at least for the on-road side of things, where the XR is built a little bit, again, more for off-road riding. Now, this next set of specs actually kind of makes both of these bikes seem like they should feel relatively similar in this department, but it's not until you look at the horsepower and torque curves, or until you throw a leg over one and see what you can get out of them, that you notice that they really are, well, kind of different. And I would highly encourage you guys to take a look down in my sources section. I'll have a link to dirtrider.com that did a dyno test on both of these bikes, so you can actually check out the horsepower and torque curves there, which do look different, and I think sort of really help explain the differences that I've noticed in between these two. But as far as the max horsepower and the max torque goes, the DR650 actually has 1 horsepower more than the XR650, or at least that's what dirtrider.com's dyno showed. It also showed that the DR650 makes 0.8 foot-pounds more torque than the XR650L does. And again, this can kind of be seen on that torque curve, but the XR650L really feels like it's a lot more willing to get up and go, especially just from a dead stop or from just kind of a slow rolling speed, where the DR650 kind of seems like it takes a while to get going. And keep in mind that we're talking about these bikes in their stock form. I do have aftermarket foam air filters on both of these bikes, but that's it as far as performance goes. And again, from what I've heard from a lot of you guys, this bike can definitely make some really pretty quick improvements. And actually, my buddy Jason made some pretty quick, free, easy improvements on his DR650. And that certainly makes this bike a little bit more peppy, feeling like the XR650 comes stock. I think some of that might have to do with how the carburetors work, but is again, I think, sort of where the torque kind of hits on this bike. And it definitely makes this bike, again, a bit more fun to ride, along with sort of the shorter wheelbase and probably the much stiffer suspension. This bike is much easier to pull the front end up off the ground. It wasn't until I put the 14 tooth on this bike that I was able to, I would say, easily pull the front end up to loft it over any sort of obstacles off-road, or maybe just for a little bit of wheelie fun. That being said, though, the DR650 does seem to have, I think, maybe a little bit more power left over once you're at 70 miles an hour. And again, the XR650 can still totally do it. And I don't know that I would specifically avoid it because of that. If you're planning on doing a lot of highway riding, there are some things that would kind of make me steer you a little bit more towards the DR if highway riding, again, is something that you'll be doing a lot of, and we'll get into that in a bit. And this next difference is also kind of another odd one, because looking at the numbers, you would think that the DR650 would be better in this department, but the XR650L is actually better. The front and rear rotor on the DR650 are noticeably larger than those on the XR650. But again, I think because of the stiff suspension, and maybe because of the fact that this bike is 20 pounds lighter, it really just seems to brake, I mean, really a lot better than the DR650. Again, as crazy as a lot of you thought that I was when I pulled that tank off and put this tiny 2.8 gallon tank on here, I just wanted to see what this bike was like to ride in its stock form. And that is actually my next sort of biggest difference between these two, is not only the fuel capacity, but also the MPG, and then therefore the range. So like I mentioned, this bike has a 2.8 gallon tank, where the DR650 comes with a 3.4 gallon tank. So that means you get 0.6 more gallons of capacity. However, during my initial test with some on and off-road riding mixed in and the stock sprocket, I got 50.22 miles to the gallon with the DR650 and only 43.6 miles to the gallon on the XR650. And while of course you can't pull every last drop out of either of the tanks, if you were able to do that, on the DR you'd get somewhere around 170 miles out of the tank, where the XR650L here, you would only get 122. Which means not only is it going to be much more expensive to ride this bike on long trips, but you're also going to be able to go almost 50 miles farther with the DR650 than you are with the XR650. Now, of course, if you rode either of them a little bit easier than I usually do, you could probably get much better range out of that. And if you guys have any big range numbers that you've been able to get out of your bikes with the stock tank, or I suppose even if you have an aftermarket tank, feel free to let us know your numbers down below. I'd be interested to hear. You can stick a much larger tank on each of them. The DR650, I think you can get a 6.6 gallon tank. And actually, I want to say the XR, you can probably get somewhere near 6 gallons as well. I think there's actually a company in Australia that makes a tank for this bike that's somewhere around 7.3 gallons or something insane like that. And there may very well be some other larger tank options for this bike. But of course, the more fuel you add, the more weight you add. And if range is more important than a light, nimble feeling, then of course it makes more sense to put a larger tank on. And I may very well do that with this bike. You'd of course also be able to stick on a auxiliary fuel tank, like a Rotopack or something. There's lots of different options out there. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to go with yet. I definitely still need to get my luggage racks on both of these bikes. And then once we do that, we'll be taking both of them out to do some moto camping. So again, if you guys want to make sure you see that, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. Now this next thing definitely makes, I think, the DR at least seem like it's, again, a little bit better for on-road riding. Actually, these next couple things. And that's the fact that the DR650 has a cush drive, which, if you guys are unfamiliar, is essentially just some sort of rubber isolators between where the driven sprocket is, or the rear sprocket, and the actual hub itself, or the sort of innermost portion of the rear rim. I did actually do sort of a trail side fix on this bike, where I shoved some little pieces of old motorcycle inner tube into that cush drive to sort of shore that up, because I did have quite a bit of slop both in the forward and back motion as well as the side to side. And of course, keep in mind that I'm not a mechanic or anything. I'm just a somewhat mechanically inclined content creator. The right fix, of course, would be to buy a new kit to replace the old isolators in there. And the difference there is that the Honda XR650L does not have a cush drive, so essentially the piston and the rear tire are directly linked via, well, the chain and a few other components, but there's no sort of isolation between that, which definitely can wear just about everything out a little bit quicker. It's also part of the reason that people run into issues chewing those splines off between the front sprocket, the drive sprocket, and the countershaft that comes out of the engine. You of course can add an aftermarket Cush Drive hub on this bike if you really want to, but honestly, I kind of like the fact that this bike feels, well, a little bit more raw and a little bit more responsive. Obviously the DR650 again is going to be a little bit better for on-road riding, but I feel like you kind of can tell that there is just a little bit of more softness there when you go to hit the throttle and also when you back off. Of course, for on-road riding and for long-term riding, that's going to be vastly superior. But personally, I do feel like I can tell the difference just in riding them. The other reason that the DR650 should go through chains and sprockets a little bit slower than the XR650L here, though, is that this bike actually has a 522 O-ring chain, where the XR does have an O-ring chain, but it's a rather small 520, and you can just see that just by looking at the chains. The DR's chain and sprockets just look much more beefy than those on the XR650L. Now, the final biggest difference that I've noticed between these two that, again, would make me probably want to steer you guys that spend a little bit more time out on the pavement towards the DR650 and kind of away from the XR650 is the ergonomics and sort of the ability to change those ergonomics. The XR650L to me on my adventure rides, which are about an hour north, and then I like to spend a couple hours riding off-road, and then of course have to make the trek back an hour. At the end of the day on this bike, I'm feeling kind of cramped and kind of uncomfortable. Some of that I think maybe can be attributed to the fact that the seat concept seat on here is an inch lower than the stock seat would be. So there's just a little bit more of a V to sit down in, but especially before I lowered the back of this bike, well, basically a quarter inch more than I lowered the front, the back seat just always was at too much of an angle, and I just always felt like I was sliding down towards the front of the bike, which of course then you're having to constantly hold yourself up, which is again going to add to the just overall fatigue of the ride and is going to make things just less comfortable and is going to make you not want to ride as long, where the DR650 has a much flatter seat and you're just, well, able to kind of shift around a little bit more without, again, having to hold yourself up. But even beyond that, the DR650 comes with some rubber isolated foot pegs, which honestly, as much as I didn't like them on the KLR, I really don't mind them on here. I don't know how much of the vibrations they actually take away. I don't really notice a whole lot of vibrations in the XR's pegs, or at least not any more so than this bike, or at least it's not a problem anyways. It's not something that I don't like. The pegs just feel, well, a lot closer to the seat than they should be, so your legs are always just kind of crunched up a little bit more, and you're not able to adjust where those pegs are located because one actually is on a bracket where the other side actually gets tapped directly into the frame, which I don't really like, partially because if anything goes wrong, well, then you're tapped into your frame, and that could definitely be an issue, but also because there aren't any kits out there to move the pegs down or back at all. I don't know that I'm going to move the pegs on this bike at all, because a lot of the places I ride, it's just kind of nice to have your feet up in the air a little bit, and sure, it's nice to have them a little bit lower when you're standing and to have them, you know, be able to move back a little bit to give yourself a little bit more room between your shift lever or whatever it is that you feel the need to move those back for. It's nice to have those options, but as much as the location of these pegs don't bother me, it really kind of would be nice to lower them on here. Again, I don't know that I'd want them all that much lower than they are for off-road riding, because then you're kind of getting, well, a little bit closer to the end of the obstacles and a little bit closer to the bottom of the bike. But as far as a comfort standpoint goes, they're really just not in a great location. And again, because that seat is so slanted, even with it lowered a little bit more in the rear, it's not that comfortable ergonomically. And just sort of in general, while again I have put different risers and bars on both of these bikes, this bike feels a little bit more like an adventure bike, or at least a little bit more comfortable dual sport, where the XR650 just feels a lot more like a motocross bike, which for a lot of us, even myself included, really off-road is kind of nice. Like I've said already, this bike, partially I think because of the suspension, just feels like it handles single track a lot better. Any precise movements or adjustments that you need to make, this bike just seems to handle them a lot cleaner. But as far as a long road ride, I would definitely take the DR650 over the XR650 any day. So that pretty much wraps everything up, other than, I guess, to answer the question that a lot of you guys have been asking me over the last year, and that's which one I like better. I don't know that I really like one more than the other, unless we're talking again about a specific type of ride. I think if it was to be just my general adventure ride up north, on the way up to my trails, I would much rather ride the XR650 because it's just kind of fun on the road. It's just, I don't know, it's a mean feeling bike. It seems like as soon as you twist that throttle, you've got all the power right there, and it's just a very aggressive, fun bike to ride, which also sort of transfers off-road, and with the awesome suspension on here and the ground clearance, I mean, it can basically take me anywhere off-road. On the way home though, I think I would definitely appreciate the DR650 a bit more. It's, like I've said, just a little bit more comfortable. It's definitely gonna get better mileage. I'm gonna be able to go a lot farther without having to stop at a gas station. This bike, I basically always have to fill up twice, where this one, I suppose I could almost get away without filling up on the ride at all. I would basically have to be full when I leave and would probably be on reserve on most of the way home maybe, but it's definitely gonna be, I think, the better option for that road riding. And I think once I upgrade the suspension, again, this is all speculation and sort of what I've heard from you guys, I think this bike maybe will be a bit more fun off-road than it is. Maybe not more fun than this bike, but probably vastly superior in comparison to what it is now. I think once we do some carb mods on it and some intake and exhaust mods, it will definitely be a lot closer to this bike. I think there will still be some things about this bike that I will always like better, and it certainly is nice to have them just right out of the box rather than having to make a bunch of mods. But to be honest, I think the most fun bike is the XR650L, but the most sensible bike, which is also incredibly fun, I think is definitely the DR650. So hopefully that helps some of you guys. If you still have any questions, definitely let me know down in the comments section. I love to talk to you guys about bikes down there. Other than that, I don't really have too much to say. Other than that, I am incredibly excited to get back to work on both of these and to get out and do some moto camping on them. And again, if you guys want to join me on those rides, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, stay safe, stay swanky. Get out there on whatever motorcycle you've got in the garage and enjoy this beautiful world that God created. We never know how many days we've got left, so get out there and have yourself an adventure and enjoy it. If you can't do that right now, here's some more videos to check out. In the meantime, we'll catch you guys on the next one.